Let's now make our application actually do something when we click on the check button. So this is going to be the first time that our code reacts to something that happens in the DOM. And for that, we need to use an event listener. Now, an event is something that happens on the page. For example, a mouse click, or a mouse moving, or a key press, or many other events. Then, with an event listener, we can wait for a certain event to happen and then react to it. So let's try it out now. And let's actually start by getting rid of this code, because this has actually nothing yet to do with the application. But now we will actually start developing the application step by step. Anyway, in order to listen for events, we first need to select the element where the event should happen. And in this case, we want to listen to the event on this button element here. So this check button, because this is where the click that we're interested in will happen. So when we click on this button, something should happen. So let's select that button element. So query selector. And then once more, we need to go ahead and grab the class name of this button. And so here it is. Now here we actually have two class names. We have button and check, but the button class here is the more generic one, which also applies to this other button, this again button here. So the class that we are interested in is just the check class. So again, the dot for the class selector and then check. And so this will select the button element itself. So just as before, this here will then return an element. And now on that element, we can call the add event listener method. So add event listener. And this is a method. And so we need to call it once more using the parentheses. Now, there are actually multiple ways to listen for events in JavaScript, but using this add event listener method is the best one and also the most used one. Okay, now into this add event listener method, we first need to pass in the type of the event. And in this case, it's just a simple click. So the name of the event is actually click. And so that is the first argument that we pass here into this function. But now we actually need to tell the event listener what to do. So basically, we need to specify the reaction to the click event. And we do that by defining a function. And that function will contain exactly the code that should be executed whenever this click event happens on this check button. And that function is going to be called the event handler. Now, this method, this add event listener method here, is a special kind of function. That's because as a second argument, it expects this event handler function that we just talked about. So again, here as a second argument, we now need to pass in a function value as an argument. And that's probably quite confusing, I know, but that's no problem at this point. This will make more sense as we do this over and over again. For now, just remember what you learned in the fundamentals section, which is that a function is also just a value. And if a function is just a value, then we can also pass it into another function as an argument, just like any other value, like a string or a number. So let's create that function here. And just like before, we do that writing function, and then the curly braces for the function body. Okay, and now all we have to do is to specify what should happen. And to start, what we want to happen is to simply log to the console the value that is here in this input field. So console.log document.query selector, and actually we already have this code up there, but let's just write it again. So remember that this element here has the class guess, and then from this element we take the value. Okay, and that's it. So let's save it, let's test it, and then we will just go over this again. So I will write 9, and now when I click this button, this 9 should appear down here in the console. And it does. Okay, great. Great job. So let's quickly go over this again. So we selected this button here using query selector, and then we used the add event listener method on that element to attach an event handler. And that event handler is this function here. Okay, so this is again just a function expression. So it's similar to when we do just, for example, this, and then just log something to the console. So this is also just a function value, right? And then we can assign that to a variable, and then we call all of this a function expression. You remember that, right? And so here, basically, we did the exact same thing. So we wrote here a function that has a similar format as this. We simply did not assign it to any variable. Instead, we passed it directly here into the add event listener method. So as a first argument, we had the name of the event that we're listening for, which is a click. And then as a second argument, we have this function value. And this function simply contains the code that we want to execute whenever the event happens. Also, note that we do not call this function here anywhere, right? We only define the function here and then pass it into the event handler. But it is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the event happens. Okay, that's important to understand. So again, this function will not be called immediately once this script here is executed. This function will only be called as soon as the event happens. And you can also see that here in the code because, well, we don't call the function anywhere using the parentheses, right? And so, yeah, again, we're just really passing it into the add event listener function. So this works just fine now. Let's try here another number. So now we get 99. And of course, we can also do some DOM manipulation here. For example, let's just, grab this piece of code here and paste it here as well. Give it a save. And now when I click this here, not only the value from this input field will get logged to the console, but also this message here will change. So the text content of this element. So you see, correct number and now 22. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the game yet. So I just wanted to show you that, but let me get rid of this actually. But now let's actually start to slowly build up the game. So in the real game, when we click on this button here, of course, this number from this input field will have to get retrieved. So let's start with that. And so we already did this here, but instead of just logging it to the console, let's actually save it into a variable. So const guess and then equal this. Okay. And now let's log it to the console just so we see it. And so this should now do the exact same thing, but we first stored that value into a variable and then we log it afterwards. All right. Now remember how I said in the fundamentals section that usually whenever we get something from the user interface, for example from an input field, it usually always is a string. So let me show that to you here now. So again, we use the type of operator that we already learned before. And now when I put this here, we indeed get a string. However, we will eventually have to compare this number here with a randomly generated number. So that's going to be basically the secret number that we will have to guess. And so if we want to compare numbers with numbers, we need to first convert this string to a number. So let's do that here using the number function that we also already used before. And so now let's print both here. So the guess and then the type. And now we get 5. And now it's also here in purple. And we get that it's a number. And now let's start to implement the game logic here a little bit. But just the simplest case, which is the case that there's actually no guess. So usually in an application like this, which has an input value from the user, the first thing to do is to check if there actually is a value. And if there is no value, well, then we can print something to the console as a response. So we can say if there is no guess. And let me actually show you how that would look like. So if I click on the button now, indeed we get 0. And 0 is a falsy value. Okay, and so guess here in this logical context of the if-else statement will be false. So that's what we learned in the fundamentals section, right? So any value that is here in this condition part will always get evaluated to a Boolean. And so since this guess is 0 in this case, and 0 is a falsy value, it will be converted to false. But we want something to happen whenever this is false. And so here we actually want a true value, right? And so we simply use the negation operator to then invert this Boolean from false to true. And so in this case, we can then print some sort of message here to our message field or message element. And so let me again go ahead and copy it from here because we already did that before. So let's say no number, and then as always an emoji here. Let's do this one, or actually it's more like forbidden. So that's the one I used. Let's save it. And so now whenever I click this button, let's check it, then indeed we get no number. Okay. So again, this works because 0 is falsy, and so guess here is false now. But then we use the not operator to convert it to true, and like this, we can then make this block of code execute. Because remember, it only executes whenever this whole condition here is true. Okay, and so with this, we implemented the first scenario. So again, usually the first scenario is always to assume that there is actually no input. And then we need to respond to that somehow. Now, in the next video, we will then implement all the other scenarios. For example, where this guess here is actually correct, so where it's equal to the secret number. So we will have to generate that secret number then and compare it to the guess. But let's leave that to the next video.